Hello, my name is Jennifer Lemak. I'm the Chief Curator of History here at the New York State Museum. We are currently in a collections prep area, and in honor of Black History Month, I thought I would share with you a collection of 10 or so artifacts relating to African American history in New York State. Enslaved Africans first came to the colony of New Netherlands in 1626. And shortly thereafter, the colony's free Black and enslaved African populations grew. And I thought I would start by talking about two different collections on two sides of the state, one dealing with free Blacks and another one dealing with enslaved Africans. So the first one deals with this stoneware. We have three pieces made by a free Black potter named Thomas Kamara in Lower Manhattan, New York City. He worked on Lodge and Cherry Streets around Crown Point. The Dutch name for that is Corliss Hook, which you can see on his pot here. But he worked in Crown Point, Corliss Hook, between 1793 and 1812. He was a prominent member of the free Black community in New York City and was very involved with the African Church and worked for 20 years as a potter and ultimately emigrated to Africa with the American Colonization Society in 1820. And what's interesting about these three pieces of stoneware, and Thomas Kamara's stoneware is fairly rare, is that he, in addition to making jars and other stoneware vessels, he also made oyster pots. And recent research has come out on his oyster pots, which are here, and this is an example of an oyster pot with the capped lid. The oysters would be pickled inside the jar, and then a stoneware cap would go on the top, and then these could be shipped all over the Atlantic world. But an oyster man named Daniel Johnson, who was also a free Black living in New York City, we think he commissioned Thomas Kamara to make specific pots for him. And as you can see on this map, Thomas Kamara's pottery was over here at Crown Point or Corliss Hook, and Daniel Johnson's oyster business faced the East River, not too many blocks from the pottery. The other collection I thought I'd talk about is actually on the other side of the state in Montgomery County, Canajoharie. And I initially talked about enslaved Africans in the colony of New Netherland, but once the English took over in 1664, slavery really took off in the colony. The Duke of York had stock in the African Slavery Society and decided to use the colony to build up the slave trade. So by 1750, New York State had over 9,000 slaves or enslaved Africans, and it had the most slaves of any colony north of Maryland. So in Canajoharie, Montgomery County, New York, we have a small collection dealing with an escaped slave named Harry, who was owned jointly by John Glenn and John Diefendorf. They purchased Harry for $220, and according to the letters, it was at uncertainty of his temperament. And shortly thereafter, in 1806, Harry ran away. And we have a broadside here for a reward for $50, where John Diefendorf and John Glenn put an ad in the local newspaper, hoping to gather information to get Harry back to them. And what's interesting about this broadside is that it said that Harry spoke both English and Dutch. And the Dutch had been out of New York State since 1664, yet there's still evidence of the Dutch language being spoken, especially in some of the rural areas close to the Hudson Valley and in the Mohawk Valley. But we have three letters that state that Harry was spotted in Rutland, Vermont in 1807, and then in Boston, Massachusetts in 1808. And we have no other evidence. We don't think Harry ever went back to John Glenn and John Diefendorf, but we do have this example of a slave collar, which is inscribed J.S. Glenn, Montgomery County, New York. We have no evidence that John Glenn ever made his enslaved people wear a slave collar, but we have surmised that possibly he had the slave collar made in an effort to intimidate his other slaves in the hopes that they would not run away either. So we have, two collections that kind of depict the different aspects of the African American experience in New York State in the 17th and early 18th century. One of a free Black community in New York City, and then one of an enslaved African resisting his lot in life and in resisting slavery in Montgomery County. So the next set of artifacts I'd like to talk about starts in the 1840s. Again, we're back in Montgomery County, and this time with the Phillips family. And we have a daguerreotype of a man named Philip Phillips, and we have his Bible. And he was able to purchase land from Garrett Smith in Franklin County, New York. Franklin County, New York is up in the Adirondacks. And beginning in 1840, Garrett Smith, who was we refer to him as a radical abolitionist. And when I say radical, I mean that he was one of the few people in the 19th century who actually believed that blacks and whites were equal. Several abolitionists, while they didn't believe in the morality of slavery, they still did not believe that there should be equality between the races. But Garrett Smith was one of the few, and in the mid-19th century, in New York State, African American men could only qualify to vote if they owned $250 worth of property. So Garrett Smith, being a land survey and probably one of the largest property owners in New York State at the time, decided to sell lots of his land specifically to free Black men in the hopes that they could then vote. So the communities in Essex County, Franklin County, all around Lake Placid in the Adirondacks became known as Timbuktu. And it was Garrett Smith's kind of experiment to bring Black farmers to the Adirondacks in the thinking that if they owned land, then they could vote and take part in the political process. So Philip Phillips purchased land from Garrett Smith. We have their surveying and land deed, and we have his Bible. And then we also have a ticket to the ratification of the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, and it allowed Black men the right to vote. Up until this point, New York State voted that measure down 3 times, the final one being in 1869. So it was with the 15th Amendment that Black men were able to vote in New York State. Now, we have some family connections going on the table, and Philip Phillips' daughter, Elizabeth Phillip, who is in this ambrotype and daguerreotype, married Bromley Hoke, who is here in this cabinet card. And Bromley Hoke, we know about him because he decided to, in 1863, enlist in the Massachusetts 54th Regiment to serve in the Civil War. After the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, it allowed for Black men to enlist in the Union Army. And while there was no specific Black regiment in New York State, many of the colored men of age went to Massachusetts and enlisted in the Massachusetts 54th and Massachusetts 55th regiments. So we have Bromley Hoke's one of his Company G 54 Massachusetts Infantry ribbon, and the New York State Library also has a collection of his Grand Army of the Republic ribbons. He served for 2 years in the Army and was discharged from a wound that he received in 1864. After he came home, he married Elizabeth Phillips, and the two remained married until the end of the 19th century, when they both passed away within a couple years of each other. And then finally, kind of thinking about community and the different ways that it plays out around the state and around the nation, we have an Emancipation celebration ribbon from the Pan American Exposition in 1901, which took place in Buffalo. And what's interesting about this specific ribbon, although it was in honor of the Pan American Exposition, which was basically a World's Fair, emancipation celebrations took place around the country. Slavery was abolished in New York State in 1827 on July 4th, and many of the free Black communities in the state decided not to celebrate it until the day after on July 5th, in solidarity with their brothers and sisters who were still enslaved in the South. And what's interesting about emancipation celebrations, and this one is specifically from Waverly, New York, which is a tiny little town in the southern tier. Emancipation celebrations were part of the Black community celebration well into the mid-20th century. And if you look at old newspapers in the 20th century, you can see calls for the Emancipation picnic, and the Black community would come out and celebrate their community ties and their family members. So this is a nice ribbon that kind of helps us piece together different parts of the African American community, as well as the big World's Fair celebration in Buffalo in 1901. So the final group of artifacts I thought I would talk about as we quickly march through time with African American history in New York State is a sample of artifacts and documents related to the Civil Rights Movement. After the Civil War, Reconstruction worked to transition the United States into a country that no longer had enslaved people, and also worked to reconstruct the United States as a whole. African Americans at that time were given specific rights with the 14th and 15th Amendment, and then throughout Reconstruction, through 1870, they enjoyed a lot of newfound freedoms and opportunities, both politically and socially. Ultimately, Reconstruction failed, and by the end of the 1860s, the former Confederates were back into power, and the nation was just tired of all of the Reconstruction drama. So in a lot of ways, all of the hard-fought victories during Reconstruction kind of receded into the ethers, and Jim Crow kind of took root specifically in the South, but Jim Crow in some respects and segregation and discrimination really continued in New York State and took root in various different ways. So at the beginning of the 20th century, African Americans got together specifically in Niagara and started the Niagara movement, which was headed by W.E.B. Du Bois, William Trotter, and a group of African American men and women to legally fight for civil rights for African Americans. And the Niagara movement, within 5 years, turned into the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And they were headquartered in New York City. And while we don't think of New York State being on the forefront of the civil rights movement, it certainly was. And a lot of New Yorkers helped to fund what was going on in the South in the mid-20th century. So we have an example here of the crisis from June 1919. The crisis was the NAACP's publication, and this one specifically dealt with African Americans in World War I. And in the Civil War, World War I, World War II, African Americans served with valor, and each time they went to war, they would come home thinking that I served my country, I died for my country is going to give me equal and civil rights. And when that didn't happen after World War I, and then it didn't happen again after World War II, that was really the start of the modern civil rights movement, the one that we think about with Martin Luther King and the March on Washington. But before we get to that, another thing going on in the 1920s in New York City was the Garvey movement. Marcus Garvey was an immigrant from Jamaica who immigrated here in 1916. And he had kind of not a fresh idea because there were black nationalists in the 19th century, but he really kind of struck New York City at the perfect time. He arrived in New York City right during the Harlem Renaissance. There were huge population flux in northern cities with the Great Migration. African Americans were leaving the South for the first time ever in gigantic numbers and moving to take industrial jobs in the North. So for the first time ever, northern cities' black populations exploded, and Marcus Garvey was there at the right time. So he was preaching and kind of following a black nationalist movement. He wanted black people from around the globe to unite and kind of earn their economic independence from white society. He wanted to have his own black businesses, black newspapers, black stores. He wanted descendants of African descendants to be completely self-sufficient, and he wanted this globally. He had a Back to Africa campaign where he wanted the black people from all over the world to move back to Africa and be completely self-sufficient in their homeland. He had several followers. By 1920, in Harlem and New York City alone, he had over 2 million worldwide. And we have one of his pamphlets, Marcus Garvey, Is He the True Redeemer of the Negro? And we also have his organization was called the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And we have one of his dues cards and membership card, and then one of his pins. So he was ultimately deported and sent back to Jamaica, but he had a huge impact on the 20th century as a whole. One of the big impacts, and we can kind of see kind of the Marcus Garvey and the black nationalist movement 20 and 30 years later, is with Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, who also promoted black nationalism. And we have a broadside from a solemn march that took place exactly a year after his assassination in 1865. And what's interesting is that Malcolm X's parents were actually Garveyites, and in his autobiography he talks about them attending UNIA meetings in Detroit. We also have a CORE hat. CORE stands for the Congress on Racial Equality. It was started in Chicago in 1942 by a group of black and white college students, and then quickly was headquartered in New York City. And like I mentioned earlier, we tend to think about CORE and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee kind of being a Southern issue and Southern groups, but discrimination and segregation were widespread in New York State, particularly in the larger cities of New York City, here in Albany, Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo. African Americans throughout almost the entire 20th century did not have access to higher paying jobs. Most times they were forced to live in specific wards of those cities. They couldn't get a mortgage a lot of times in New York State. So there were CORE-sponsored protests happening in Rochester and Syracuse throughout the 1960s. And several of the leaders of CORE, Bayard Rustin and James Farmer, who were behind the 1963 or 1964 March on Washington and Freedom Summer, were all headquartered out of New York City. So while a lot of times we don't think of New York City and New York State in general being part of that 1960s civil rights movement, there were a lot of protests happening on the local level across the state, in both big cities and small towns. Finally, I'd like to end with Shirley Chisholm, who is one of my favorite characters in history. Shirley Chisholm was, in 1968, she was elected the first Black female elected to the United States Congress. She served New York's 12th congressional district, which is made up of Eastern Manhattan, parts of Brooklyn, and parts of Queens. And she specifically worked for women's rights. She wanted education reform. She worked for veterans' rights. And she, in 1972, decided to run for president. This is an example of her campaign poster, and we have her campaign pin. She was the first African-American candidate to run for a major party's nomination, and she was the first female to seek a nomination from the Democratic Party. And I thought I would share a quote that I like from Shirley Chisholm with you. When I quote, "When I die, I want to be remembered as a woman who lived in the 20th century and who dared to be a catalyst of change. I don't want to be remembered as the first Black woman who went to Congress. And I don't even want to be remembered as the first woman who happened to be Black to make a bid for the presidency. I want to be remembered as a woman who fought for change in the 20th century. That's what I want." And so we absolutely love Shirley Chisholm. So finally, I thought I'd end on a fun note and show this poster from 1964 because I'm a fan of the Temptations and Papa was a Rolling Stone. But the Apollo Theater in Harlem was opened in 1913, and it's still in existence today. But everybody really kind of recognizes and kind of thinks about the Apollo because of its famous amateur night, which started in 1934. And it's the place where Ella Fitzgerald, Lena Horne, Sam Cooke, and James Brown were all discovered at a Apollo amateur night, and then took off to have huge and fantastic careers. The Apollo Theater, which is right smack dab in the middle of Harlem and kind of serves as a community center, was placed on the National Landmark Registry in 1983. And I'm sure as soon as COVID's over, it will be back and opened, and everybody will be enjoying visiting the Apollo for some great music. So on that note, I want to thank you all for joining me today. And if you are ever interested in doing more research on some of the collections we have here, we have others that I didn't show. Everything is available for research. Hopefully, once we're open again, we will put it back on exhibit, and we will continue to collect and document the lives of African Americans in New York State. Thank you very much.